Hey Optimancers, Chris here. Tunberry JX asks, you mentioned in your optimized scribes build that Arcana and History are the obvious picks for the Knowledge Cleric's expertise. I don't see much use of any of the knowledge skills, except sometimes Arcana and Investigation. Would you consider a video going over all or most of the skills and how you typically see them used, what uses they should have, and or how to use them as a DM? Okay, so I think skills are a great topic because, and I don't think this just applies to D&D, but you play any tabletop role-playing game with a large list of skills, it's difficult to know as a DM what exactly is covered by each skill, when to call for checks, what role will be needed for success, and how to keep all the skills relevant. And as a player, what skills to take in order to be good at the things you think your character should be good at, as well as how to use some of the skills that don't see play very often. Before I get into how skills work in D&D, just a quick announcement for my viewers. For the time being, I am going to be releasing videos on Monday as normal, but not on Fridays. And basically, I've fallen a bit behind on my schedule, so I'm going to be using the extra time to catch up. Once I'm caught up, I'll be resuming twice per week videos. And this video was originally going to cover everything I know about skills in D&D, and it was going to be an hour long, so I am going to split it up. In this video, I'm going to cover how skills work in the rules, different ways they can be used that aren't in the rules, and which rules are likely to change or disappear in the 2024 Player's Handbook based on the playtests we've seen so far. And in my video next Monday, I'm going to cover the 18 skills in D&D, how the rules say to use them, and give some tips that will hopefully give you some ideas for using skills that don't seem to come up as much, both as a player and as a DM. If the way you're using skills right now is in any way different from what the rules say, or what I'm going to be sharing today, and you're happy with the way you use them, this video is not intended to persuade you to change. However, hopefully, I'll cover something in the rules that maybe you didn't realize was there. Or maybe something you thought was there isn't. Or maybe I'll provide an idea from my own experience that might give you more tools to choose from when you handle skills in D&D. So I guess I'll start with the basic terminology. There is no such thing as a skill check in D&D. Doesn't exist. You will never see any official D&D product reference a skill check. Nor will they ever say, have the player make a stealth check or persuasion check, because D&D has ability checks, as in your 6 ability scores. Skills represent a specific case where a character or monster adds their proficiency bonus to an ability check. So there are strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma ability checks, and that's it. But if an ability check is called for and a certain skill would apply to that ability check, then the skill proficiency is added. An ability check is a roll that the DM calls for when a character or monster attempts an action other than an attack that has a chance of failure. For every ability check, the DM decides which of the 6 abilities is relevant to the task, and the task difficulty is represented by a difficulty class. The more difficult the task, the higher the DC. And note this says typical difficulty classes on this chart, so these are not the only DCs you could have. But this chart kind of works as a guide for a DM setting the difficulty of the task. So there are 2 parts of this I want to highlight. The first is, it says here an ability check is when an action is attempted, implying maybe an action is being used. And in most cases, an ability check does require an action. But there's lots of cases where it might require a bonus action or no action at all, or even more than an action. For example, you don't need an action to roll initiative, and that is an ability check. My advice to a DM is to have the ability check require an action as the default. Then you make exceptions if the rules say so, or it just makes sense to you. Like if your character is trying to entertain a crowd with a dance routine, I'm probably going to require more than an action for the charisma performance check. Well, determining whether your character knows what kind of dances people in this region enjoy might be an intelligence history check, and I might not require an action at all. The basic rule of ability checks is that they are called for by the DM when the results of an action are uncertain. So 2 things here I think are useful tools for a DM. The first is that it is the DM that calls for the ability check and determines what the check will be. There are exceptions when the rules specifically spell out how an ability check is used. So if I want to use my action to escape a web spell, I don't need the DM to determine if there is a check and what that check will be. It's spelled out right here in the web spell how it works. But if I am dealing with, say, a merchant who sells magic items, and I say, I'm going to roll persuasion to try to convince the merchant to sell me that magic item for a copper piece. If I do that, I'm not playing by the rules. By the rules, I would either roleplay the interaction or describe what my character is trying to do, and then the DM would let me know if an ability check is called for and what it would be. Though there's nothing wrong with asking if an ability check could be used. Like I could say, can I use persuasion to try to convince this merchant? That's fine, but it's not my decision whether I can or not. That's up to the DM. And according to the rules here, an ability check is only called for if the results of the action are uncertain. There is a very good chance that the DM will determine there is a 0% chance that merchant is selling me that magic item for a copper. And if that's the case, then the DM isn't supposed to call for an ability check at all. And I bring this up because I interact with DMs who think they are required to come up with ridiculous DCs in these situations and then express frustration how a character that has a ridiculous bonus to their roll can do things that should be impossible. Now, my recommendation to any viewers in that situation is don't consider the character's bonus to an ability check at all when you're deciding whether to call for the ability check in the first place, or what that ability check should be. Persuasion isn't mind control, and so when a DM says there's simply no way that this merchant would sell me that item for a copper piece, my modifier to persuasion doesn't change whether the ability check should be called for. And here's how I handle it as a DM. I only call for an ability check if the results of the action are possible, but not certain. And that's what the rules say to do. I'm going to cover 2 ways to use ability checks that aren't covered in the rules. Here's one I use quite often, and I really like it. I call it degrees of success. So let's say the party finds a magic item, and this magic item is a wand that has historical significance. Well, I might call for an intelligence history check to recall that knowledge. But maybe I'll say, there's a DC of 10 to know this wand was owned by the 3rd king of Alteria, who died under mysterious circumstances, and it was their prized possession and used for communication. And maybe a DC of 15 to also know the wand was used to cast the tongues, speak with animals, and speak with plant spells. And maybe a DC of 20 for the character to actually recall the specific command word the king used to activate the wand. And maybe a DC of 25 to recall that the wand bore a curse, where an attuned creature more likely died from their wounds, so they have disadvantage on their death saving throws, or something like that. And you can apply degrees of success to all kinds of ability checks. Like, maybe if I'm trying to haggle with the merchant over a magic item, there's simply no chance of getting them to sell it to me for a copper piece. But maybe it's a DC 15 to get them to reduce the price by 10%. And maybe if I get a 20, I might get them to reduce it by 15%. And maybe that's the most they would ever take off the price, so there's no DC 25 or 30 or anything like that. Degrees of success isn't actually built into the rules, so there can be slight compatibility problems. Like, for example, if you have an ability that allows you to re-roll an ability check if you fail, well, that doesn't really take into account degrees of success. So maybe I didn't fail altogether, but I didn't get the best result. Well, then, as written, the ability wouldn't apply. But again, I'm using ability checks in a way that's not covered by the rules. So as a DM, I could say, sure, you can use that ability because we're playing off grid here. And that's degrees of success, but here's another kind of ability check that's not in the rules. So some DMs call for what I call phantom ability checks. I don't use this one very often, but sometimes the DM might ask you to make a wisdom perception check, for example, and then you tell them the result, and then they respond, interesting. But in reality, there was no uncertain task involved. They were just messing with you to, set a tone. Like you're exploring somewhere spooky and they want you off balance and guessing what the check might have been for. Nothing wrong with doing this, though I probably wouldn't overuse it, just when you're trying to create a certain mood maybe. Either way, it's not in the rules. back to things that are in the rules for now, because this one may not be in the 2024 Player's Handbook at all. At least it looks that way with the playtest documents. Opposed checks. So rather than have a set difficulty class for an ability check, it's a contest between the creature attempting the task and another creature that's opposing them. So you're trying to grapple a monster, and they're trying not to be grappled. Both would make their ability checks, compare the results, and the higher result wins. If the monster gets a higher athletics or acrobatics check than your grappling character's athletics check, they are successful in preventing your grapple. In the case of a tie, you do it so nothing changes from before the contest took place. So in the case of the attempt to grapple, the grapple would not occur. So grappling doesn't use opposed ability checks in the playtest, nor does anything else, and it seems like if you attempt a task involving an ability check, the DM is just going to set a DC, and that's it. Maybe the DC will be higher if it's something that's in opposition. We don't have all the details yet, and nothing's set in stone. The rules describe a skill as a specific aspect of an ability score, and proficiency in that skill demonstrates a focus on that aspect. So you have a crime scene, and analyzing clues would be an intelligence ability check. Gandalf and Sherlock Holmes are both very intelligent, but Sherlock Holmes has specific aspects of his intelligence that make him more suited to this particular task. Well, recalling some piece of ancient history, it would probably be the other way around. Now, technically speaking, of course, the DM never calls for an investigation check, because they're actually calling for an intelligence check, where proficiency investigation would apply. Any D&D sourcebook, anytime a skill is being called for, it's always presented as ability check, with the ability being used, and then the applicable skill proficiency in parentheses afterwards. In reality, DMs call for acrobatics, perception, intimidation, or athletics checks all the time, because the associated ability score is implied, and it's not really necessary to say you need to make a wisdom survival check when I could just say make a survival check, because the player already knows that the survival check is a wisdom check. At least maybe, because we do have this rules variant. This variant allows the DM to mix and match skill proficiencies with ability scores. They give the specific example of a character that is swimming a far distance. The DM might call for a Constitution athletics check rather than a Strength athletics check to represent the stamina required for such a task. Now, this is a variant rule. That means it is not part of the standard rules, but if you're the DM, you can choose to use it. But you certainly don't have to. It's definitely easier to just ignore this variant, and that is my recommendation for DMs, is that at least most of the time, just stick with the standard pairings of ability scores and associated skills. It's less complicated, and it requires less communication between you and the players when you call for an ability check with an associated skill. But just be aware that the variant is here for when it makes sense to you. The big burly fighter is trying to physically intimidate the merchant using their size and muscles. Well, you might very easily decide that a strength intimidation check makes more sense than charisma intimidation in this case. Speaking of which, since that specific example is one I see fairly often, I'd also recommend that if you're going to do that, you might give that burly fighter advantage on their check if they have the powerful build racial trait, because the trait doesn't impact that character's strength modifier, but I would think it would be extremely relevant in the case of physical intimidation. Now let's discuss passive checks. Here is another rule I'm expecting might not be in the 2024 Player's Handbook at all. So a passive check is an ability check that doesn't use a die roll. So let's say my character's in this hallway here, and I want to check for secret doors as I move along the hallway, so I announce that to my DM. So if we ignore passive checks, technically, if there is no secret doors where I am, then there's no uncertain result for me checking for secret doors. There won't be any. So if we follow the rules, no ability check should be called for. Then I move to here, and again, no secret door, so no ability check. Then I move here, and there is a secret door, so the DM calls for an intelligence investigation check, and now let's say I fail that check. My character doesn't know there's a secret door here, but as a player, it's just been revealed to me that there is. And that's not an ideal situation. So what the DM could do is call for checks in every square, whether there's a secret door or not. So phantom checks. Calling for a check in every square, though, it's going to get really old really quick. Definitely not the best use for phantom ability checks, in my opinion. Now, the way you can handle it, though, is through passive checks using this rule. So you take the character's modifiers they would apply to their intelligence investigation check, you'd add it to 10, and that would be treated as the results of their check. So their passive investigation, let's say it's 16, and they come up to a secret door, and the DC to find it is 15. So they find it automatically. No D20 roll required. But if the DC to find it is 17, well then they fail automatically. Again, no roll required. The most common passive checks I see in the game are passive wisdom perception checks. A monster's trying to hide from you, so they roll a dexterity stealth check and it's opposed by your passive perception. If the DM keeps track of the character's passive perceptions, they can even do this secretly. And if the passive wisdom perception of the characters isn't high enough, then the DM doesn't need to let the players know that anything is hiding from them at all. Now, like I said, this rule may be disappearing in the 2024 Player's Handbook. We don't know for sure yet, but for me, that's not really an issue, since I hardly use passive checks anyways. So if I am the DM and you're in the hallway searching for secret doors as you go, I have you make an intelligence investigation check right away. And then when you get to a position where a check would be made, that's when I apply the result. I guess I prefer the more randomized result than an automatic pass or failure. Here's another one where a lot of players don't know the rule, or at least don't know the whole rule. So there's a rule that if 2 or more characters team up to complete a task, the one with the highest modifier can attempt the check with advantage. Now, most players know that part. Here's the part that's often not known or forgotten. A character can help only when 2 or more individuals working together would actually be productive. So helping an ability check is not always possible. Here's my suggestion. If you're DM and a player asks if their character can help another character with an ability check, ask them, how are they helping? If it sounds like it would actually help, then provide advantage. So for example, character A is trying to hide from the town guards, and the player of character B wants to help. As a DM, you ask how they're helping character A hide. A lot of the time, the player has no idea. They just knew there was a rule for working together. But if you can't explain to me what you're doing that would actually help, then it's not going to impact the check. Now, if you tell me that your character is going to create a distraction by making some noise that might attract the attention of the guards, thus taking away their attention from character A, giving them a chance to hide, okay, that's helping. Character A gets advantage on their check. And we have group checks, where a group of characters are all trying to achieve the same task, and more skilled characters may be able to assist those less skilled. If a DM calls for everyone to make an ability check, that doesn't mean necessarily that it is a group check, because with a group check, it should be a case where either the characters succeed or fail as a group. If it is a case where some characters might succeed and others might fail at the same time, that's not a group check. With a group check, if at least half the characters succeed on the check, the entire group succeeds. But if less than half succeed, the entire group fails. So, a party is trying to sneak quietly past some distracted guards. Skilled characters might be able to show less skilled characters where to step or how to step, but if less than half succeed on the check, then the guards hear something. Doesn't matter who from, the party is all going to fail. So, you might call for a group check in that kind of situation. Now, when it comes to ability checks involving skills, there's certainly a lot of ambiguity, and it's left up to the DM to decide. I will note that if the playtests are any indication, there is more guidance for the DM coming in the 2024 Player's Handbook. For example, if you want your character to help someone making an ability check, there are specific requirements spelled out for you. The influence action tells us how to use skills with charisma ability checks. It spells out which skill is used, specifically spells out that the influence action isn't mind control, describes how the check is made, tells you how to set a DC, and what the results of success and failure are. The study action gives us guidance for how to use intelligence ability checks involving skills. And there's a feat that allows you to use a bonus action for the study action, and each intelligence-based skill is listed along with the areas of knowledge each skill covers. The search action will show us how to use wisdom ability checks involving skills. Again, each wisdom-based skill is listed with a description of what kind of information each skill would provide. Now, these are not officially published yet, so these are all subject to change, but I am already using them for guidance when I DM and I'm calling for an ability check and wondering what skill to use. Like, I occasionally have a player ask if they know anything about a specific kind of dragon. I knew that should be an intelligence ability check, but I never was sure what skill to apply. Now I have the player make an intelligence nature check. So if some alterations are made, that's no problem, but I like the format, which gives me a tool as a DM to help me set ability checks involving skills. In my video next Monday, I'm going to cover all 18 skills, what the rules say they cover, when you might call for their use, how as a player you can use some of the skills that you don't see in play as often, and how as a DM you can do the same thing. Make some of the more rarely used skills more relevant in your games. Otherwise, until next time, I am going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you next Monday. I appreciate all of you who watched this video to the end, but I especially appreciate the support of my Archmage level patrons, who also run and play in games on my Discord server, which I join in as well. We play D&D, but we also play a ton of other systems. Check out Archmage Patronage on my Patreon page, linked in the video description. We already have these fantastic people: Awesome Face, Benjamin, Christophe A., Condor, Dash Panther, Dave Peters, David Lotz, David W. Skibbins, Ido, Isaac Leister, James Thomas, Jeremy Brown, Jonathan Lexi, K.J. Aurelio, Kavathe, Leonardo Gonzalez, Migish, Mr. Muffins, Rye Squy, Steven Edmondson, TUM, The Algorithm, and Valentin.